As folks are trickling in, I will say, as I always do, that we'll probably start around 1:03 because it takes a minute for the room to populate. So welcome to those of you who are joining us, and just sit tight as we wait for the rest of the crowd. Hello, everybody. I know folks are still trickling in, but I think it's time for us to get started. I have some opening remarks to share, but I will keep them brief so we can honor your time. My name is Dr. Karen Morosky Rigney, and I'm one of the two associate directors of the Writing Center at Michigan State University. I want to take a few minutes to welcome you all to the final event in our speaker series, Writing Centers and Access, today featuring Dr. Cristina Cedillo. Your enthusiasm and engagement with this series this semester has been inspiring and humbling, and we're so glad so many of you could join us for today's final installment. I'd like to direct your attention to the email where you received your Zoom link to join us today. In that email, there's information on how to navigate our webinar space. I hope you'll find it helpful. I'd also like to note that today's talk will be recorded so we can share the event asynchronously via our YouTube channel and website. And lastly, after our time together ends, we'll reach out to you again via email one more time with a response survey regarding today's event. I'd like to thank the Cal Engaged Pedagogy and Programming Event Fund for making this event possible. I'd like to thank our grant co-authors at the Center for Language and Teaching, and I'm especially grateful to the Citizen Scholars Program for their incredibly generous funding, which enabled us to ensure ASL translation services and CART captioning for all events. I'm also grateful to the administrative team of the Writing Center here at Michigan State University, Dr. Trixie Smith, Dr. Grace Pregent, Colton Wansittler, Monica Schellberg, and Amanda Broman. Lastly, I want to thank the members of our Writing Center's Accessibility Committee who have worked tirelessly to put on these events for you and for me and for all of us. I gave more extended opening remarks at the first event of this series, and if you'd like to view them, the link to that script is in your information email as well. For now, in the interest of your time, I'd like to turn things over to Adriana Aviles, the grad student coordinator of our Writing Center's Accessibility Committee, without whom this series would not have been possible. Adriana's hard work, dedication, and passion for the work of Access regularly inspires me and those around her. And it is my honor to introduce her to you all today as the speaker who will introduce Dr. Cristina Cedillo. Adriana, I thank you for everything you've done for our committee, our Writing Center, and our community. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Karen. Dr. Cristina V. Cedillo is an assistant professor of writing and rhetoric at the University of Houston Clear Lake. Their research draws from cultural rhetorics and decolonial theory to focus on embodied rhetorics and the rhetorics of embodiment at the intersections of race, gender, and disability. Their work has appeared in CCC, RSQ, Composition Forum, and other journals and various edited collections. Cristina is co-chair of 4C's Latinx Caucus and lead editor of the Journal of Multimodal Rhetorics. I was first introduced to Dr. Cedillo through ongoing conversations Karen and I had during the fall semester of about this speaker series. If I'm completely honest, the ableist in me had never thought about accessibility or disability justice before I started my work as the accessibility coordinator for the Writing Center at MSU. So it also isn't a coincidence that I had not heard of Dr. Cedillo or their work. But the moment I heard her, their last name, I felt seen. Dr. Cedillo's scholarship brings to light the complacencies enacted in the academy and the need to push against the norms and status quo of acceptance. She is a professional troublemaker. New York Times bestselling author Lovey Ajayi Jones describes a professional troublemaker as someone who critiques the world, the shoddy systems, and the people who refuse to do better. While a professional troublemaker isn't somebody who manufactures chaos or crises, they do understand that can come from being honest and authentic and going against the tide. Professional troublemakers deal with it because they have a cause. I would extend this to purpose as well. And from reading Dr. Cedillo's work, one could surmise that their purpose is to empower students, colleagues, and other scholars towards disability justice reform, to critique the institutions, systems, and the people that perpetuate acts of violence against marginalized groups, or to create what the late great civil rights leader and longtime Congressman John Lewis called good trouble. Although I have just started my work with accessibility and disability justice, I know the work of Dr. Cedillo and the featured speakers that have graced this virtual stage will greatly influence my progression as a scholar. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cristina V. Cedillo.
Thank you so much, Adriana. That was a really moving introduction, and I can only hope that my work over the course of my career lives up to such an amazing description. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that I can project the PowerPoint slides that I will be using. If anyone would like a copy of these, feel free to email me, or if you need some of the notes that I am working from, because of my own disabilities, I often have to do what I call it's a mix of a script and just kind of thinking through things in community. So just let me know if anybody would like that. Is that visible?
Yes.
I'm very briefly going to move my notes over here so they do not interfere with the okay, well, first of all, I want to say thank you for allowing me to be here with you today in a virtual setting. I'm coming to you today from Houston, Texas, which is settled on the historic lands of the Akwakita and Karankawa peoples, although my own background is in the lands of the Guayutekans on the what is now considered the border of Texas and Mexico. So today I want to talk a little bit about the time of writing, Kairos, Chronos, and the pedagogical consultation. As is my tendency, this talk will be a mix of what seems like the theoretical and the practical. That being because a lot of my work has to do with reorienting our attention to what are often called, the basic building blocks of rhetoric and writing, and trying to show how it is that they have typically been construed in a way that leaves out a good number of people, particularly marginalized. So in this presentation, I'm going to be discussing time, how it comes to have meaning, how its valuation occurs, and how that relates to rhetoric and the teaching of writing. And so, yes, I might get a little theoretical before I get down to the practical, but there is a reason for that. often, especially under the present circumstances, as we continue to deal with a pandemic and physical and legal state violence, which is being wrought in places such as Arkansas and Georgia, though they are by no means anomalies, this is ongoing. It seems like demands on our time have been intensified, and it may seem that no matter how hard we try to keep up, there's simply no time or not enough time to accomplish all that we have to do. But even under the best of circumstances, whatever or whenever that may be, that's often the case. So in thinking about time and praxis and pedagogy, I will impose on your time with the theoretical in order to talk about how we need to reorient our thinking and, by extension, our embodiment in different spaces, lest any suggestions for best practices become yet another way to more habitual conditions. And so it's necessary to interrogate what we mean by time and how it affects our very being. In his landmark memoir, Bootstraps, Victor Villanueva, and that is Villanueva, Victor Villanueva distills the purpose of teaching composition, saying that, quote, writing is a way of discovering, of learning, of thinking. Surveying the works of scholars like Emig, Bartholomew, Bruffy, and Corbett, he finds in them a return to some of the same concerns found in the work of Cicero and Quintilian. He connects the more contemporary figures' focus on the psychological effects of language use and the possible democratization of the classroom to the ancients' espousal of reading and search for rhetorical models. Villanueva suggests that this recursive process proves necessary, arguing that, quote, without a knowledge of history and traditions, we risk running in circles while seeking new paths. Without knowing the traditions, there is no way of knowing which traditions to hold dear and which to discard. Self-evident? Maybe, yet the circles exist. And of course, in this text, Villanueva is deliberately trying to show that scholars from minoritized communities typically must learn and demonstrate familiarity with the dominant culture's traditions to be credible and to get by in academia. But as he goes on to show in his work on historical rhetorics of the Americas, what might not be as evident to those whose knowledge-making traditions have not consistently been excluded by the Academy is that this circle he describes often remains a closed one. While we are encouraged to look back to the past, indeed, judged by our familiarity with certain time-honored figures, that historical past does not belong to us all. By creating what James M. Blount terms a tunnel of time, Eurocentric perspectives enforce tunnel vision as we look back at the past, or more precisely, to a deliberately constructed past that centers itself as reality through exclusion. He states that Eurocentricity is, quote, thought of as a sort of prejudice, an attitude, and therefore something that can be eliminated from modern enlightened thought. But he warns that Eurocentricity's claims to reality are anchored in statements about empirical reality as propositions supported by, quote unquote, the facts. To some outside of the field of cultural rhetorics, this problem may seem an issue far removed from the teaching of basic writing, one that even detracts from a focus on the fundamentals of composition. Nonetheless, it should concern us all because it demands that we focus on an aspect of rhetoric so central and vital that it often goes uninterrogated, the notion of time. After all, one of rhetoric's principal tenets is that speaking and writing well requires that we know the right time and place for delivering a message. In other words, kairos. But what does that that mean for those of us who get locked out of that tunnel of time and who actually want to obliterate said time? Because ultimately, this is not only a matter of history, but also a matter of maturity. Black, Indigenous people of color, queer people, trans people, disabled people, people who have not only been denied a history, even though we know we have many, people who have experienced and continue to experience material and physical violence to deny us any space in what is to come. And so that's why I chose this image on the slide. It gives the impression of a circle, a tunnel, so to speak, but you'll notice that it doesn't cohere. It only coheres against all the different smaller circles that are indeed filled, right? So it creates that illusion against that which is really there. The presumption of time is a privilege. After all, the Academy was founded with by those with the leisure and means to study and opine, a privilege that teachers still often take for granted that students have, even though students and we ourselves must manage to juggle work and family. Financial and food insecurity, the continuous trauma of state violence, social exclusion, and health issues, including the present pandemic. At the same time, pun very deliberately intended, due to these very real concerns that inequitably affect the most vulnerable, we are often positioned as suspended in time. Lack of access equated with deficit, with being left behind in terms of what we should already know when we step into a classroom. Framed as the other against which the standard is upheld. In other words, we exist within different time/spaces. Times and spaces. What we are dealing with is not time as a scientific constant, but our perception of it, as Blount explains, such that the dominant culture convinces us that we all inhabit a time stream beneficial to its preservation. That preservation relies in fulfilling the needs of white supremacist capitalist colonialism, wherein the body, and please note that I said the body and not people, the body becomes yet another natural resource to be regulated, altered, or eradicated in the interest of wealth. That stipulation leaves out many people who cannot work in certain ways. That may seem far afield from what brings us together today, but we see that process very much at work in any classroom where students are expected to submit and conform to particular bias standards of literacy, judged on their ability to meet said standard regardless of their lived experiences and living conditions, or they are simply weeded out. That is usually what gets termed as rigor, but it translates to the institution making money off the student who supposedly couldn't hack it, but who might have already had to overcome myriad obstacles to even matriculate. And so this proves a matter of orientation and basic practicalities due to the inability to understand why one does not seem to be welcome in the academy. And that's part of the experience, of course, that Villanueva is describing, but so do many others. When seeming reality is oriented against you, as in against your experience of things, writing can prove an impossible task because while the instructor speaks at the right time and place, you have never actually been there. Thus, when we talk about Kairos, we are talking temporality. In the meantime, temporality and cultural politics, Sarah Sharma reminds us that these are very much not the same thing. She writes, quote, "Temporalities are not times. Like continually broken clocks, they must be reset again and again. Temporalities do not experience a uniform time, but rather a time particular to the labor that produces them. People's experience of time depends on where they are positioned within a larger economy of temporal worth. The meaning of these subjects' own times and experiences of time is in large part structured and controlled by both the institutional arrangements they inhabit and other people's temporalities. Riffing off of Agamben's Homo sacer, she uses the term temporal labor to denote, quote, the experience of laboring within a temporal infrastructure while simultaneously being cast outside of it. In other words, time is usually not our own, whether in our writing or our attempts to finish it because it's due, right? The assignment is due. And yet, if we follow the thinking of someone like Diane Massey, who suggests that entities and space-times are being constituted in the same moment, then this tells us that, one, our laboring under this particular temporality is what reinforces its supposed reality, and two, there are ways to work around it. Indeed, we are witness to this possibility now. As disability scholars and activists have well noticed, many temporal accommodations are being extended to counter a loss in productivity due to the pandemic. We wonder where these accommodations were before. But for now, I want to turn to thinking about how this seemingly inexorable dominant culture temporality affects writers rhetorically before turning to think through some applicable insights that might help us deal with the problem of time. And so here on the slide titled Contending with Time, we see a clock with the silhouette of a person walking, appearing to walk. And of course, I was drawn to this image because it's assumed that this person is probably male, the person is able-bodied, but at the same time faceless. So this idea of privileging certain bodies often has to do with how productive and on the move they can be, whether it's at work or rhetorically. And so just to kind of recap, just to ask ourselves, do we mean time or temporalities? How do our notions of productivity rely on standardized notions of time? Under what conditions are we operating as temporal labor? And now I want to turn to thinking about the implications for ethos and exigence that comes with thinking about time. For people contending with the pressures of white supremacist capitalist colonialism, cultural genocide, physical violence, ableism, racism, colorism, ethnicism, homophobia, transphobia, and misogyny. And I deliberately list all of these because there are many people who indeed have to live under all of these conditions at all times. For people contending with these pressures, ethos and exigence are coinciding concepts based in community rather than the rhetoric. This rhetorical matrix often goes unnoticed within standard studies of rhetoric, but that disregard usually leads to privileged construals of ethos and exigence that are violent because they require that writers ignore their own experiential ways of speaking as knowing to take on the voice of the academy. Not only does that erase people's culturally situated ways of communicating, this also hides how the global systems driven by capital and signified by said voice silences those who it harms. For example, by disparaging native rhetorical praxis when every university in the Americas is built on occupied land, by using disabled students' writing to diagnose and pathologize them and others, or by demanding that vulnerable peoples forced to migrate/immigrate across territories and borders conform to arbitrary fluency standards, or else not be heard. For some people, our students, A so-called basic essay may be the first time they have access to a public platform. To deny them this in favor of privileged notions of ethos and exigence is harmful. But even if all that matters to someone as a snipsnip proper spelling is the theoretical implication, while settling on privileged notions of ethos and exigence ensures that the full ecology of a rhetorical moment goes unnoticed or ignored, since both are predicated on time. In Euro-Western tradition, a la Aristotle, ethos is, quote, a matter of making speech ethical and the trustworthy character of a speaker as artistically created in speech. And given Aristotle's writing in things like the Organon and his Politics, creating the impression of ethics in a speech, I'm sure has gotten him far these many millennia. According to Bizel, ethos itself tends toward the ineffable, relying on impressions of authority and credibility based on how well a speaker's words exemplify the sanctioned spirit of it. It affects the effectiveness of communication, manifesting as a sense of connection between rhetor and audience. An individual must cultivate presence that adheres to the, quote, and this is Halloran, conventional rather than the idiosyncratic, the public rather than the private. Yet, a rhetor must also stand apart from the collective to further an individual goal. The underlying ethic may be communal, supposedly, but the aim is one's own, meaning that an effective ethos is based in a delicate balance of identification and dissociation. However, this understanding of ethos does not account for diverse orientations to a rhetorical situation, to Kairos. It reveals patriarchal bias by assuming a distinction between public and private life that has historically seldom been afforded to non-males whose lives are more highly regulated by social and legal strictures, and that's referring to people who are not male. This also presumes a division between public and private spheres thought to distinguish Euro-Western modernity from its antecedents, an assumption often used to frame more communally oriented groups, even in the West, as backwards and quaint. And of course, we can turn to folks like Baba and Said for explaining how time works in rendering the other, capital O, other, as the other by talking through geographies and time reference. Philosopher Walter Mignolo, and I'm citing him here as a philosopher, explains how European colonizers framed native storytelling customs as illiteracy and a lack of proper history. So it always keeps coming back to time. This scheme greatly affects Euro-Western views of ethos, furthering an Aristotelian impression of ethos as logocentric and suggesting its basis in permanence. Words that matter, as in having importance and making manifest the individual, words that are meant to last. In contrast, stories are ostensibly ephemeral because they require a living community. Consequently, while ethos plays a crucial role in effective communication, the terms by which we apprehend the concept cannot be universalized. Privileged notions of ethos rely on the possibility of permanence, but they do not necessarily ask whose future and thus who we are writing for. In addition, exigence informs how ethos coheres. It is in response to a pressing concern that the impression of credibility emerges. Euro-Western tradition via Bitzer defines exigence as something waiting to be done, a thing which is other than it should be, that can only be addressed through discourse, although it can also result from a rhetor's choice to bring one issue over another to the audience's attention. And I'm deliberately not mentioning who this particular voice is, but feel free to ask me later why. exigent relates to kairos since a problem demands a response appropriate to the conditions of a certain moment in time and space. A message will not go over well if the speaker is viewed as the wrong person for the undertaking based on race, class, gender, disability, and so on. At the same time, the norms of the space establish whether a person qualifies to be in the position to speak by defining the value of different embodied identities. Hence, bodies ground a rhetorical situation, addressing what compels the use of rhetoric, receiving exigence, and conducting rhetorical action in response, substantiating exigence. Euro-Western tradition tends to ignore the role of the body in establishing exigence, even though a speaker's identity is also an element of kairos, as both an agent and a result. This oversight ensures that the speech of marginalized rhetors is misinterpreted or ignored in favor of, quote, scientific proof. And so it discounts the very real physical and material violences people face and the ecologies that they are part of, ensuring that such violence will go unseen by the dominant settler culture. Unseen, though such violence includes the constant threat of physical, cultural, and environmental violence. And despite its being so woven into the fabric of colonial states, that national mythoi even justify its lethal results. And you see that even now with the justification of how the rollout has affected different communities and why certain governmental agents have failed to do and act in certain ways. Reminiscent of the 80s with Reagan and the AIDS crisis. The relationship between ethos, exigence, and the body in white stream rhetorics is profoundly unlike that found in communally oriented communities. Ethos includes the rhetor and the location or position from which that person speaks or writes. As such, it encompasses audiences' expectations regarding a body's associations with particular spaces. This connection becomes especially salient when someone's public presentation defies convention, or when they engage audiences who are unreceptive or hostile, and they must prove they belong in space. That person's ethos means differently than that of a speaker with an, quote, invisible or privileged identity. Just by being who they are, the rhetoric manifests as polyvalent, relaying the chosen message and claims that they are worth listening to, that they have a right to take a space in a given location. This holds for privileged bodies too, albeit abductively. In other words, such bodies have always already claimed their right to space and speech. Colonial orders' attempts to render our lives transposable and exploitable means that our rhetorics must also inevitably respond to local and global histories of violence. For those who are survivors of apocalypse, ethos and exigence are fundamentally entwined in and with time vis-a-vis chronos, what we can think of as the longue durée of chronology of struggle for rhetorical presence. And so on this slide, you see an image of what is usually termed an upside-down map or Mercator projection. And it's supposed to kind of throw you for a loop. But if we think about the implications, when we stop to think about the Euro-West as the North and everyone else as the South, and then we start to reorient our histories to think about the traditions that originate within those often denigrated spaces, the picture looks very different. And of course, even the way we think about the map has to do with that time of struggle. Of why is it that we are consistently trying to be, quote unquote, seen or visible? So we can think about that struggle even in the way that we often think about the map, right? An Aristotelian notion of ethos simply does not provide a means for appreciating such rhetorics. By ignoring bodies and therefore the knowledges that only particular bodies can access, the dominant culture lays claim to objective reality by granting subjectivity as temporal accommodation to those who have traditionally held in this space. Thus, for marginalized people, rendering the present rhetorical moment as a slice of time alone cannot account for the exigence of the rhetorical situation. Kairos is seizing the moment and responding appropriately in the right time and place, but that standard explanation is too limited to account for our trying to carve out space and time. As Malia Powell reminds us, spaces are practiced into being through the acts of story making, made recursively through specific material practices rooted in specific land bases, through the cultural practices linked to that place, and through the accompanying theoretical practices that arise from that. One's rhetorical identity is informed by the stories and as relationships that connect people and where those stories happen, our communities. They highlight relationships that Thomas King deems peoplehood, a concept that emphasizes the integrity and well-being of a group. The group includes audiences across multiple time spaces, one's communities, one's ancestors, and those who will come after, all of whom help shape one's ethos. Rhetorical spaces aren't just a where, but a when. What settlers deem history and futurity are integral aspects of the now. A more complex understanding of temporality, space, and ethos among marginalized groups defines a kairos that stands counter to colonial history, if we can call it that. Contending with oppression is an omnipresent exigence as marginalized people seek to establish presence. As Tara Yasso notes, subjugation is often well disguised in the rhetoric of shared normative values and neutral social scientific principles and practices. Therefore, we must be willing to admit the limitations of the habituated rhetorical tradition and so-called academic rigor to bypass harmful universalized notions. Even fundamental terms like ethos and exigence can harbor epistemic violence under the guise of proper practice. Richard Delgado notes that too often we use terms, topics, and metaphors familiar to dominant culture audiences while diminishing the intents and effects of resistance. And so a commitment to listening and learning to appreciate vulnerable people's full humanity demands our understanding how rhetoric and culture are interconnecting concepts, as Andrea Riley-Mokovitz states. And it requires us to investigate meaning making as it is situated within a specific cultural community, whether it is a tribal community, digital community, an archive, or a group of craftswomen. White string notions of exigence, and here I'm borrowing from Sandy Grande when she talks about white stream as the white mainstream, but including ableism as an integral part of that, because as Jay Domage states, the typical subject is viewed as a cis male, white, affluent, able-bodied, right? So we can think of whiteness as the absence of having to explain your identity and explain yourself as who you are. White string notions of exigence dislocate one specific moment from its totality, suppressing the reality of real people. And so what does that mean for us? And so having said that, I kind of want to, in the interest of time, talk about that. And the reason why I wanted to take that tack first is because when we talk about time, especially when it comes to things like racialized and disabled identity and what that means for teaching and pedagogy and consultation in terms of teaching writing, we often tend to think of time as a very externalized thing. How can we give students more time? How can we dedicate more time to a particular topic to make sure that they get it, without necessarily interrogating the ways in which those very quote-unquote basic notions of time are actually undergirded by ableism and by a capitalist tendency to think of productivity as worth. And we often don't think about that. But this is a twofold issue because part of what I hope the proceeding has made clear is that when it comes to those of us who are from minoritized and marginalized communities, we don't think of time in the same way. There is no one standard temporality except that which already excludes us. And it is done by erasing us from the historical record, from the rhetorical record, right? The idea that our students often don't get to learn much from people of color, queer people, disabled people, speaking as themselves rather than having to take on a white stream voice. And what that means then is that the two notions of time are really interconnected, because it's not a coincidence that the most vulnerable populations are often the ones with the least amount of time, right, at their disposal. But at the same time, often if we don't interrogate this notion of kairos versus chronos, we're also asking them to write under this illusion of a time, a history that they might not see themselves as part of. And so because of that, there is often a cultural disconnect that requires either acculturation or assimilation, but still requires that we adjust how we exist in time and space. So in other words, when we think about something like the canon of memory, something so fundamental to rhetorical studies, we have to ask, how do we remember? What do we remember, and for what purpose? Because sometimes our students are going to have something different to say than we do. Okay, so that's something that we need to think about. And so just in the interest of time, some of the other things to think about as we move forward is that if we want to avoid this use of things like ethos and exigence as tools of violence, asking students to erase their own histories and praxis that have been developed over time, then we need to start thinking in different ways and orient our praxis differently. So thinking more intersectionally rather than focusing on white stream notions of what that means. It means that we focus on activism, and whether we want to think about that as being out of the streets, and a lot of the times for us, for many of us it is, the same history that keeps people right now in cages, in dog cages, is the same erased history that says that this country has never done such things, right? So of course it's a trust. But whether we take to the streets or not, in terms of an activist orientation, it means that we want to see a different future. And for this reason, these are orientations that have to be done and not just claimed, okay? We have to co-conspire, not just be allies. And we have to think about how to make space to be heard and how to listen to others rather than just speak over or be spoken over. We have to claim that space, but we also have to make sure that others have space as well. And so two of the orientations that I am hoping to get to talk about tomorrow as we think about our conversation is a decolonial perspective and approach and a CRIP approach. And to me, these really support each other well by talking about how we can relearn and reclaim our voices and our praxis, and how we can reorient our relationships to time, right? So CRIP time means that those of us with disabilities are going to need different amounts of time, but also different kinds of time It is not just enough to say, oh yeah, take an extra day. That time needs to be molded in particular ways that facilitate learning for those of us who are divergent. We also have to think about how to undo the habitus of time. And I chose this image because apparently habitus is when you're studying insects and how they usually act. And that's how you can tell who they are, depending on what time of the year it is. And so I thought that that was very interesting, especially because, you know, a lot of insects have that camouflage. And so it also ties into this notion, this concept and problem of invisibility, of how our identities have been usurped in history by stereotypes and what Adela Licona terms non-images, and how by reasserting our histories, we can start to develop greater rhetorical presence. And so some of the other things to consider as people like Carmen Chavez and Ramon Roscoe talk about, we need to start thinking about time and positionality and orientation from below, and thinking about how it is that we can start thinking about what time we need in the classroom, or whose time we demand to see expressed rhetorically in writing, in a way that does not exclude the more vulnerable and the more marginalized, but at the same time, making sure that we do not impose these expectations of vulnerability, and or that we don't stereotype people's experiences based on what we think. And so these are just some of the teacher questions that I will leave you with. And so when we think about Sean Wilson, decolonial scholar, who talks about respect, relationality, and reciprocity as the basis for good relations, how might we start to help students feel empowered by providing opportunities where they can create realities? So not just engaging their own histories of other communities, but where we can go from here. How we can become more attuned to the different chronologies that sustain stories and the diverse temporalities that we inhabit, including crypt space, crypt time, and things like that. And how do our notions of time overlook students' embodied needs? And so this is going to be both rhetorical and practical. And so those are some of the things that we need to do, especially when we think about how we can accommodate students whose instructors might be dead set on proceeding with business as usual. And then how can we engage decolonial and crypt notions of time post-pandemic? And then finally, and I won't read those, I will aloud, but I will allow you to see them, and if you need me to, I can read them out loud, just let me know. But just in the interest of time, these are some student questions that I ask my students to consider and then share their answers as we take on the notion of what time means to us as differently embodied individuals, both in the stories that we're telling, but also the spaces where we tell those stories. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cedillo. This was fantastic. And I especially appreciate, and I'm sure a lot of folks do, these question slides and the opportunity to kind of have those and look at them after our time together today ends. They're really, really generative. And speaking of questions and answers, it's that time. We have about 10 minutes for folks to ask questions. And I actually have one ready. I'm going to put it in the chat as well. But folks, please feel free to use the question and answer feature on the webinar to submit more. This first question that's come through came before the session began, which is why it's not in the Q&A feature. This person asked, when thinking about the colonization of space, How do you feel the very act of writing is a colonized or possibly colonizing act? How can we think about this process in a decolonial, unableist way?
That is a great question, polyvalent question. But I think at its most basic, the way that I start to consider this is that as my own mentors have taught me, both professionally and in more familial ways, is that when we think about colonization, oftentimes we think that we have to get back to a particular notion of time. And that is really interesting because if we think about Mark Rifkin talking about settler time, and that's someone whose work I've just started to engage with, that's something that Rifkin talks about, right? That when we think about decolonization as returning to this more pristine past, we're actually taking on some of that view of history from a settler perspective. How do we return to the past? It is always about futurity and where we can go from here, right? So it's the present as it extends into the past, while still engaging and trying to preserve those ways of knowing that have been passed down to us. And so it's not a coincidence that a lot of the work on futurity, right? Like whether it is queer futures, Afro futurity, thinking about indigenous futures, it is always coming from marginalized groups who have often been denied a history and or are trying to be denied any purchase in history right now. So it's when we don't have the time, when we don't have the space time, what can we do? Like we dream of a future where we will have that, and then we act in a way where we can bring that into being. And so the act of writing can very much be a colonizing act, right? And Mignola talks a lot about how inscription, of course, alphabetic text gets substituted for the pictographs and becomes a way of saying that people who do not write in particular ways are illiterate and they have no history, they're savages. But it's interesting because even within European histories, not everybody who was literate necessarily inscribed or wrote in the way that we think about it. And so what I would think of in a way to kind of distinguish that is to start thinking and imagining new ways in which we can engage writing and what writing can possibly look like. So for example, when we think about the multimodality offered by web pages and writing for the web in a way that Angela Haas talks about, right, in terms of wampum and hyperlinks, and thinking about how our stories ourselves are hyperlinked even as we tell them among our community. What we can start to do is maybe think about reorienting writing towards liberatory purposes. And it doesn't necessarily mean using, like the master's tools, so to speak. It would mean maybe breaking them down and doing new things with them in ways that are hard to pin down, and in what Munoz would call disidentification, if that makes sense.
Very much so, thank you. Our next question for you: how do we navigate creating space for and supporting other modes of time in the Writing Center around different types of writing, or different types of assignments? I'm sorry.
I think one of the main things from my limited perspective, and I'm sure other people can speak to this. For example, I saw that Mary Lee was here. not to put you on the spot, but part of what happens in the Writing Center is that the Writing Center often can prove the space where students feel more welcome or at home than they do in the classroom. A lot of it has to do with the kind of personal relationships or interpersonal relationships that can be created. And so I've always thought of the Writing Center as a more humanizing space than a classroom space is. And so I often try to think about what would people be doing in a Writing Center, and how could we make that the foundation of our pedagogy, right? But that the notion of time is also really interesting because we are all running on these notions of gotta clock in, gotta clock out. We only have so much time to give to students. But I think in order for us to support other modes of time around assignments, we have to start thinking about embodiment first and foremost. What would it mean to orient Writing Center appointments around crib time and space? What would it mean for the disabled or racialized body to be centered in a consultation? And I think that'll look different for many different communities. But I think one of the things that we have to think about is understanding that sometimes what it means is just making space. It might mean something as simple as just sitting with someone and holding space for them as they try to come to terms with their feelings of disbelonging, and then thinking through with students about where that comes from. And especially, I think people are going to see this with students who are non-traditional students with families and who work. And it's not a coincidence, they have less time, so they're always on the go. But sometimes they're the person who might need 5 minutes just to slow down and be reminded that above all else, they matter. And as one of my very famous professors, not very famous, very favorite professors once told me, I'm not egocentric enough to think that my classroom space is the end all and be all of your world. So take care of what you need to take care of, and I'll be here. And so I think practicing generosity with effort is another thing that we can do. And that basically means understanding that there are things that we can never understand. And we have to be generous with ourselves because we're never going to get it right 100% of the time either. And it's okay to be human among each other. And I let students know that that's what it means to be human, I think, more than anything.
That is an absolutely perfect and moving note for us to end on this afternoon, as we have just reached that 2 o'clock mark. Thank you, Dr. Cedillo, for spending your afternoon with us and for this incredible presentation. This is really generative. I really appreciate, and I've already said, I'm sure other folks do too, you sharing those slides that are complete with those questions that will foster conversation long after this afternoon ends. So thank you again. And thank you to everyone who has joined us. This is the final event of the speaker series. And so from the Writing Center at Michigan State to you all, thank you for joining us this semester. It's been great getting to learn with you. It's been great getting to connect with you. And we look forward to more of this in the future. That said, everyone have a fantastic afternoon and rest of your semester. And Dr. Cedillo, the Writing Center will see you tomorrow.
Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.